Hello, everyone. It's 10 o'clock and it's time to get started. My name is Glenn Midkiff. I'm the director for the Center for Stakeholder Engagement at the Lewis College of Business, the Brad D. Smith Schools of Business at Marshall, and I'm also the interim chief of staff for academic affairs. I'm excited to be with you today. Welcome to Herd Insights, Small Business Webinar Series. We thank you for taking the time to attend this event. It's a part of a webinar series given by the Lewis College of Business, faculty and local business professionals. This series showcases the combined expertise of our business faculty and seasoned, knowledgeable practitioners from the business community in which we engage. The goal of this series is to help small businesses achieve success in a changing and dynamic business environment. Before we start the event today, we welcome Dr. Avi Mukherjee, former dean of the Lewis College of Business and current interim provost and senior vice president. And he'll say a few words about the college and its mission.
Thank you, Glenn. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this exciting event. We appreciate your interest in this Herd Insights Small Business webinar series. The mission of the Lewis College of Business and its Brad D. Smith Schools of Business is to promote economic development in the regional community and beyond. We do this by implementing our strategic priorities for external engagement and economic development, including lifelong learning programs, the Business Leadership Symposium, the Dean's Distinguished Speaker Series, and the CEO panel that many of you have attended. The college has several outreach centers, including the Center for Entrepreneurship and Business Innovation, or the I-Center, that helps small businesses innovate with a focus on design thinking, the Transformative Sales and Service Excellence Center that imparts state-of-the-art sales training and education, and the BB&T Center for Leadership that promotes consulting and research projects between students and the community. The college also cooperates with the Brad D. Smith Business Incubator to help promote entrepreneurship throughout the region. As the nation and the state start rebuilding businesses and economies coming out of pandemic closures and lockdown, the Lewis College of Business is committed to supporting our local businesses, alumni, and other stakeholders in re-engaging, recharging, and redesigning their business models. Hence, we have developed this webinar series that consists of thought-provoking presentations throughout the academic year and into the summer approximately every 2 weeks. We hope you enjoy today's webinar and take something out of it to use in your business or professional activities to make West Virginia and the surrounding area a better place for business and community engagement. Glenn Midkiff will now introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Dr. Avi Mukherjee. Today's informative and engaging presentation is titled Top IT Security Risks for Small Businesses. It is brought to you by Dr. Nancy Langton and business professional Natalie Leopold. Nancy is a professor of accounting here at Marshall and is currently the Associate Dean for Accreditation and Strategic Initiatives. She is a certified information systems auditor in addition to teaching IT auditing and researching in the areas of IT governance and technology trust, and she has approximately 10 years of public and corporate accounting experience. Natalie is partner of Suttle and Stalnaker, PLLC in Charleston. She is a CPA, certified information systems auditor, and an A-certified information technology professional. Nancy has 15 years of public accounting experience with a specialization in IT audit, internal controls, and risk management. Nancy and Natalie will discuss key cyber and other security challenges and explain how to keep your business running uninterrupted and how to protect your company's information, which is all important to us right now. Please feel free to ask questions via the chat function throughout the presentation. Nancy and Natalie will answer these questions at the end. I now turn it over to our presenters. Thank you all.
Thanks, Glenn. I first want to say that I appreciate Natalie taking the time to present with me today. I've known her for quite some time through our involvement in the West Virginia Society of public accountants. She's always been gracious to come talk to my classes, and I love hearing about her experiences with IT auditing. This is our table of contents. We'll first discuss the need for cybersecurity. We'll then present some of the major security areas for small businesses, along with the risks and controls related to them. We'll finish up with some of the good news out there for small businesses. And this is our first section about the need for cybersecurity. Why be concerned? We should have always been concerned about IT security. However, COVID has sped the growth of technology by several years and really pushed some companies over what they're calling the technology tipping point, making IT security even more important. According to a new McKinsey global survey of executives, their companies have accelerated digitizing their customers and supply chain interactions and their internal operations by 3 to 4 years over the past year. The share of digital products in their portfolios has accelerated by a shocking 7 years. On top of this, many of the executives that were surveyed believe these changes are here to stay. This slide confirms the McKinsey study with some headlines from some major companies and organizations. You can see these include the Pew Research Center, which is a pretty reliable source for getting information, and BDO, which is accounting firm, and Forbes. They're all saying about this unprecedented growth rate of technology. Even the CEO of Microsoft has talked about this, saying that she's seen 2 years worth of digital transformation in just 2 months. Next, let's look at the Verizon data breach study to find out what's happening with IT security. Verizon has published data breach studies for many years now. It's a reputable source that I've even used in some of my research. The graph on the left shows causes of data breaches, and the graph on the right shows causes of incidents, regardless of whether there was a data breach or not, so whether data was stolen or not. And these are incidents relating to the availability, confidentiality, and integrity of data on company systems. You can see the numbers. There were 5,275 data breaches in the 2021 report, and 29,000, almost 30,000 incidents. The 2020 report showed just over 23,000 incidents and 3,000 breaches. So it's quite a jump from the prior year. Social engineering, as you see on the left graph, was the top cause of data breaches. Natalie's going to talk more about this later in the presentation, but social engineering is achieved mostly through phishing. On the other hand, on the right graph, you see denial of service attacks are the most common incident reported, whereas social engineering really targets a company's confidentiality of their information. Denial of service attacks typically affect the availability of the company's systems. Given the growth rate of technology and of IT security, we find ourselves in a sticky situation, or what some might call a poor state of readiness to deal with these increases. First off, cybersecurity positions are difficult to fill. In fact, some say that these positions have a 0% unemployment rate. In addition, compliance mandates sometimes are a distraction from implementing strategy. So things like data privacy regulations, SOX and HIPAA, they all require certain IT security controls, and that can be a distraction for companies from planning ahead and implementing a strategy that includes cybersecurity. My third bullet point on this slide talks about file exposure. So on average, a financial service employee has access to nearly 11 million files the day they walk into the door. And that comprises 13% of the total files. For small businesses, that number is lower, about 600,000, still a huge number. And this still comprises about 11% of all the files. So they're right up there really with medium to large businesses. Small businesses win the percent of sensitive files open to everyone with 19%, whereas the average for all businesses is only 15%. My final bullet point addresses information security risk assessments. Just 50% of companies have done this, and it's basically an inventory of what information and systems they have and thinking about their vulnerabilities and risk controls they have to prevent that. I was going over that stat with Natalie, and she kind of thought that 57% was probably high, and it probably is. So again, this is just one sample, one survey. One more thing about the need for cybersecurity, and this is particular to small businesses. Smaller organizations have the highest target for malicious email. They are probably still, not probably, but they are still important for cyber criminals because small businesses have a lot of personally identifiable information, and that's what really cybersecurity criminals are interested in, you know, your name, your social security number, etc., things that can identify you. Another survey reports that 47% of small businesses have experienced a cyber attack, so that's almost half. And out of that, think about it, another half, almost 44%, have experienced more than one. So not only are their systems insecure, but once one bad thing happens, likely is that they'll have another attack, and this could be that they don't fix what the problem was correctly, or they just have a lot of issues. Another stat I just want to throw out there is that the average cost of a cyber attack for small businesses is $200,000. And so think about that, adding $200,000 to your budget for next year. For most of you, that's pretty enormous. All right, so now I'm going to move into and quickly go through the first three control areas. The first is data backups, and an increasingly digitized business landscape, data backup is a requirement for everybody. You want to ask yourself the question, can you recover from a data loss? Even if you take into account all the controls Natalie and I are going to talk about today, you still need to back up your data. All right, it's still important. The threat landscape is changing as we speak, and so you just need to be prepared for the worst. So some things to consider are file versus system backups. So where file backups might back up your documents, it's not backing up the Word application that you created those in. You also want to consider doing full backups versus incremental. Full backups back up, so they would back up all the files. Incremental would back up just what's changed from the last time you did a backup. Think also about data on your employee devices. There's been a lot of that lately, and you want to take that into consideration that your employees may be downloading files and how you're going to address that. Also consider your recovery point objective and your recovery time objective. Recovery point is how much data are you willing to lose? So can you lose a month's worth of data, a week's worth of data, or maybe just a second or two's worth of data? And your recovery time objective is the amount of time it takes you to restore that data. So again, do you need to restore it immediately within the next few minutes, or could you wait a few hours or a week? That's going to play into your decision on what kind of backup you need to do. And again, I mentioned compliance requirements like SOX and HIPAA. They may have some additional requirements like how long you have to store backups. I talked about some of these controls, but probably the most common is the 3-2-1 rule. That means you should have 3 copies of your data, including the one that you use for day-to-day activities. So your production data, you want 2 additional copies. You should be storing those on different media. So you're probably not going to like this, but if you store to the cloud, you also want to be backing up to something else, like perhaps a hard drive or some kind of external medium. And then have one copy stored offsite. So don't keep your backup copy in the same site that you have your production version. In case there's a natural disaster or somebody breaks into your offices, they may be able to get both of those and then you're down one of your backups. The last thing on here, well, you also want to think about your digital and physical access controls. Natalie's going to talk a little bit about that, but that basically means your password and then physical access to your systems in terms of a locked server room or locked backup. And again, making sure you have those sorts of controls. The last bullet point talks about testing. You want to make sure you can recover your data. So the best backup in the world won't help you if you can't recover that in case of a data loss. Some of the regulations might have a certain periodic nature of testing, like maybe every year or twice a year. So you want to make sure you're doing that and that you definitely know that your backups can be restored. Phishing, I'll run through this sort of quickly. We all know what it is. Somebody poses as a legitimate person or agency and tries to trick you into giving your credentials, your password, or clicking on a link or opening a file. Mostly hacker goals for this are financial, but they also might be interested in your credentials to get to sensitive information. They also might just be malicious and want to destroy your systems. There's a lot of things you can do to prevent phishing. Your IT people should stay informed about industry trends and trends in phishing altogether. They should be able to block your access to any of the malicious websites that phishers set up. Also use two-factor authentication in case they get your email. They may not be able to get in anyhow because they don't have your security question or the secret code. Another thing that I have bolded here, number 7, is employee training. That's probably your most important because the people who are getting the phishing emails are your kind of your last line of defense sometimes. And so you want to make sure everybody's aware of how to identify a phishing email. All right, the last control that I'm going to talk about is password management. So lots of us have weak passwords and we reuse passwords or we write them down or store them in equally insecure ways. These practices make our data very vulnerable. And there's a lot of ways that hackers can get your password. We just talked about phishing, but there's also software that hackers can install where they can actually get you typing in your password or sniffing your password as it goes through your network. So you want to make sure that your passwords are hashed and that they're encrypted as they go into your system. Reuse of passwords is bad. Try not to use passwords on more than one application or app that you're using. And if you think your password's been compromised, please try to think of something else for a new password. Weak passwords, generally, we think of 8 characters with letters and numbers and symbols, but nowadays we're getting more towards longer, longer passwords with actual words. So it might be a sentence or a group of words that you put in for your password. Also, make sure your company has a password recovery system so it alerts you if somebody has gone in and requested a new password. I have some controls listed here. Education, again, training employees on password management, using multi-factor authentication, so something you know, something you are, like a biometric, or the security codes or the codes that come to your phone. The last thing I want to say in here is about password management managers. A lot of us are starting to get those. They can store all your passwords for all your different applications. But remember, your password there is only as secure as the password management company. So make sure they're reliable and make sure they're requiring a long password, because that's gonna, if someone can break into your password management system, now they have all your passwords. So that can be a big issue. All right, so those are my controls. I'm gonna pass it over now to Natalie, who will continue on.
All right, so I'm going to talk about social engineering first. Social engineering is something that's very low tech. It's often referred to hacking the human. So kind of the goals of social engineering is to gain your username and password, install malware onto your computer, or maybe gain access to a secure area. But the difference is this is done through kind of human interaction. So it can be phone calls, pretending to be somebody, trying to get their username and password, in-person visits, going on site and trying to get into specific rooms that are secured, or sending any kind of phishing attacks, but they might be more specific to that person. So depending on their interests, it might involve puppies or gym memberships or travel, something like that that's very specific to that user, and they're more likely to click on it. We have a little example over here to the side. We posted a Facebook quiz with password security questions, and they not only answered it, posted it publicly, but they shared it with all of their friends. That's a pretty common tactic. Can move on to the next slide. So with social engineering, the first step to it is you're going to do some research on the company. I always like to start with just the company website. You can figure out the services, all of their locations, their phone numbers, usually employee information, at least the name, and you can get the email addresses typically. After that, you can look up all the locations on Google Maps, Google Earth. You'll get an idea of is there any kind of security outside? Are there fences? Are there security guards? Are there security cameras? And then the next thing I like to do is look at social media. People's LinkedIn profiles have a lot of information about the company. It will list things that people specialize in, which gives you a good indicator of what kind of applications the company uses. And you'll get to know as many people as possible off LinkedIn, and then you kind of move on to the social media accounts. So check out Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. From there, you can figure out what are their interests, what gyms do they belong to. And you use all of this information to, either send the emails, or maybe you're going in person. You use it as kind of a disarming tactic. If you're trying to get into a location and it requires a key, you need someone to hold the door open for you. If you start a conversation with that person based on the interests they have, they'll probably hold the door open for you as a reflex. And that's kind of the point. You can move on to the next slide. So in order to prevent social engineering, what you need to do is make your employees aware of it. So there needs to be training, it needs to be annual, and you need to make sure you include all employees in this kind of training. Sometimes executives get left out of this kind of training because of their schedules, but keep in mind that the executives, they have the most access. So getting their username and password is the most valuable to somebody. And then also make sure your administrative assistants, anybody who's maybe at the front desk kind of position, understands that people may come in and try to get past them, and there'll be a sense of urgency. Make sure they understand the tactics and provide specific examples of how this might work in real life. Make sure there's a policy for locking your computer when you get up from your desk, so that somebody does come into your office, they can't just sit down at a computer and plug in some malware quickly. Make sure there's a clean desk policy, especially with confidential information. And then also have a social media policy. And you can go over the social media policy in your annual security awareness training, but you're going to find personal and professional use, talk about the security settings, making sure everybody's aware of how to set security settings, why it's important, and talk about federal and state privacy laws. The next topic we wanted to cover was online banking or corporate account takeover. And the first step to this is that cyber criminals, they try to gain access to your bank account, and they actually steal your credentials. So it will be your username and password. And that can be through malware. Maybe you reuse passwords on multiple websites. Maybe there are terminated employees whose access wasn't revoked, or you're using easily guessed passwords, or maybe the password questions are publicly available information. What I mean by that is, sometimes the security questions are, what's the make and model of your first car? Property tax tickets are public information. your mother's maiden name, that's usually pretty easy to find in a Google search, your first job, it might be on your LinkedIn profile, or maybe you mentioned it on social media, and the city you grew up in, that's also easy to find on social media. You can go ahead and move into the next slide. So the corporate account takeover process, you obtain the valid online banking credentials, then you would create a fraudulent wire or ACH transaction that goes into account, and a money mule will withdraw those funds immediately. If you look at the next slide, I just wanted to talk about, this is actually pretty prevalent for small and medium-sized businesses. There's a few reasons for that. The first one is that bank reconciliations, they're not performed as often. Maybe you're just doing them monthly instead of daily. And sometimes when they're doing bank reconciliations, they're just kind of making a list of, these are all the transactions that don't reconcile and match up to our records, instead of researching those transactions and getting back to the bank immediately. Maybe it's kind of left on the back burner for a few days. Another reason is the business size. You're gonna have access to ACH and wire origination. Any kind of regular customer account wouldn't have that kind of access. And then also small, medium-sized businesses, you're less likely to utilize additional security procedures. And it could just be because you don't have that many employees working for you. For the next slide, here's some controls that you can implement. The first one is to reconcile cash frequently, if possible daily. And that isn't just looking at your cash balance, that's going through all the transactions that have occurred. Change your passwords frequently. Don't reuse those passwords. And don't just change one character of the password as your next password. If you can, go into your online banking website and see if you can enable multi-factor authentication. What happens with this is you would have to enter in your username and password, but then there will also be another level to that authentication. So there might be a password generating token, which is kind of an electronic token, or there might be a USB token that you would have to plug into your computer. Those controls would help any kind of additional logins. And then it could also be a fingerprint. The next slide, we have some more controls. You can enable text alerts for any kind of wire transfers and ACH transactions. You probably have a good idea of what kind of transactions should be going through your bank daily. If all of a sudden a transfer is coming through that doesn't look familiar, you can log in, take a look at it, and let the bank know immediately when it happens. You can require that all of your wire transfer or ACH activities have dual authorization. So that would mean that one person logs in, creates the payment file, and then somebody else has to log in and go and approve that file. A control like this would require that a hacker has to get at least 2 valid username and passwords. That makes it a little bit harder. So they might give up on you and move on to the next target. And then the other thing I would recommend is, have a discussion with your bank. When did you open your bank account? It was probably years ago, maybe before online banking was really prevalent or before you used it as much as you do now. So talk to your bank. What kind of controls do they have in place, and do they implement maybe without your knowledge? Some of the common ones are like out of band. So if you've ever tried to log into a website, you get a pop-up that says, hey, we don't recognize this IP address. That's an out of band. New device, that's, you try to log in and it says, we're not familiar with this device. And then it makes you do additional questions. An exposure limit, that would be the bank kind of sets limits on your account. So maybe you always do $10,000 transactions or less. And then if you try to do a $100,000 transaction, they would press pause on that, try to get a hold of you first before processing the transaction. The next topic that we're going to talk about, if you want to change the slide, is vendor management. And this is really, how do you vet, select, and monitor your third-party service providers? A lot of small businesses use third-party service providers for their expertise. So some examples are the retail payment systems, outsourcing any kind of technology services, so data backup, network monitoring, cloud services and applications, Online banking is considered a third party, and even your suppliers. The next slide, we're going to kind of talk about the vendor management risks. So the first risk is cybersecurity, and that's pretty obvious if you're outsourcing any of your security services. Reputational, this is your public perception. So if you outsource any kind of customer service, and if they treat your customers poorly, that comes back to you, not on that third party you hired. If there's a data breach, that's your information, not the third party you hired. Operational, if a vendor goes out of business suddenly, that could cause some issues for you. Compliance, you want to make sure whatever vendors you hire are aware of the compliance standards in place. So that could be PCI payment standards or HIPAA laws. On the financial side, there could be excess costs that they're charging you, or maybe they're causing you to lose revenue through some other way. And then you also need to look at strategic. Sometimes your objectives don't align with your vendor. This can, maybe at the beginning of your relationship, the objectives lined up very well, and so you selected that vendor, but over time, maybe they've lost some employees. Maybe they're no longer doing that line of business as much anymore, and so your objectives just aren't lining up. And so you need to make sure you're having constant monitoring of your vendors to figure these kinds of things out. So the next slide is the vendor management lifecycle. The first step is identifying, hey, I need a third party to take care of this situation. So what's the strategic purpose and how can that third party help me? Once you define that, you'll start conducting due diligence of all the vendors, probably have multiple vendors bid for you. In the contract negotiation phase, you want to make sure that you are clearly outlining in your contract what are you responsible for versus your vendors. That becomes very important so that you understand your responsibilities clearly. The other thing you want to make sure is in a contract is some kind of performance monitoring, some sort of metric where you can measure the performance of them and make sure they're holding up their end of the deal. That might be the number of times they back up files or how quickly it takes them to answer a service call. Make sure that you can monitor that requirements and measure them against it. The ongoing monitoring piece, this starts after you already have the vendor in place. There will be some kind of ongoing monitoring you're doing. It can be every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. It depends on the risk of the vendor. When you're doing your monitoring, you'll be looking at their performance. Does it measure up compared to the contract, compared to what you're paying them? You'll do a financial review of that vendor. Are they in good shape financially? That can make a big difference. If they're not doing so well financially, you might want to start looking for another vendor. A SOC review, that's a service organization control report. Some vendors have these reports and you can review them. It gives a list of their controls, the testing of their controls, the results of that testing, and then it also lists the controls that you need to have in place in order for that to work. And then also make sure you're checking up on their liability insurance and any kind of training to make sure they're staying up to date on all of the laws that are applicable to what they're doing for you. The last piece of this is termination. So whenever you have a contract, particularly for a high-risk vendor, you want to make sure you have a contingency plan in place. If this vendor goes out of business overnight, if you lose contact for whatever reason, what are you going to do? How do you get your data? What's the process? Have a plan in place so that if this ever happens, it's already written down and there'll be a little bit less panic. I can move on to the next slide. So these are just the controls you need to have in place. And the first one is creation of a vendor management program. And that was really outlined on the previous slide I had. That's what should be in a vendor management program. You want to map the data flow, what kind of vendor access is needed, and the customer data. You need to risk assess every vendor you have. And then based on that risk assessment, you'll be performing a different level of review. And what I mean by that is your managed security vendors, so like your network or anything that could cause your business to completely come to a halt. That's a high-risk vendor. Versus maybe your landscapers, they're going to be a low-risk vendor. You don't need to do the same kind of monitoring for your landscaper as you do your managed security services. And then make sure you're doing continuous monitoring of all vendors. And that is just, so for like a high-risk vendor, you would do every year, and a lower risk vendor, you might look at that contract every 3 years. And then the next slide, this kind of just drives home that you can outsource all of your services, but you cannot outsource the responsibility. So, and that responsibility portion is doing your risk assessment and doing your continuous monitoring. Sometimes people ask, can I also outsource vendor management? You can, but when you outsource vendor management, they're doing the risk assessment and they're doing all the reporting for you. You need to make sure you read and understand those reports and make decisions based on the reports they're doing. And then you will also need to manage the vendor you hired for vendor management. Next, we're going to talk about physical and logical access. And so physical access is going to be locations and spaces. This is physical keys, offices, warehouses, buildings, versus logical access is electronic or virtual. And so it's your network, your digital resources, and electronic data files, applications, any kind of software. The risk here for small businesses is unauthorized access or fraud and any kind of financial loss or any kinds of compliance issues. So the first control you want to have with physical and logical access is to provide access on a need-to-know basis. So this is limiting to only what people need. Often what I see is you get a new hire, you sign them into the network, they have access to every single file ever. And then my question is that needed? Can you limit access? Can you group things and divide them on a need-to-know basis and make sure that employees only have access to the information they need? And there's a few reasons for this. The first one is you can prevent any kind of accidental or fraudulent changes. So an employee deleting an entire file accidentally, or maybe, as a segregation of duties issues, they're going in and making changes after the fact to hide any kind of fraud. This also helps to limit access for a security breach. So if everybody doesn't have access to everything, they would have to keep trying to get credentials until they get the right credentials to get the access they need. And make sure this applies to your vendors and employees. Oftentimes vendors are given more access than they need. A really good example of this is Target data breach happened because their HVAC vendors had access to payment data. There was no need for that. If they didn't have that kind of access, there wouldn't have been that breach. So this kind of slide just outlines the control process. So the first thing you want to do is define the sensitive data, determine the location, flow, and access, and then you'll figure out who needs this data and makes assignments and make sure duties are appropriately segregated. And then you're going to update periodically. What that means is take a look at it at least annually, but then also take a look at it every time you're making changes to your system. So if you're implementing new applications or new folders, revisit your access controls. Some additional controls are you should perform an annual review. This needs to include all applications. It needs to be reviewed by someone who's knowledgeable of how these duties should be segregated, and it needs to be reviewed by someone other than the administrator. If you can, implement kind of standard checklists for new hires and terminated user. So this would be listing all of their physical access. If you list what you gave them when they first were hired and list the changes, then whenever they're terminated, you'll say, oh, okay, they have keys to here, here, and here, and I need to remove access to this list of applications. And it's very easy as long as you're keeping documentation as you go. It's a little bit more difficult if you're not keeping that documentation. And the last one is to review administrator activity. This is a big one because it's not always reviewed, and you have to have somebody look at it who understands what they're reviewing. A lot of times, somebody will have access to the administrator and just kind of stay there for several months and go unnoticed. And the only way you would ever pick up on this is to do a review of administrator activity and see something suspicious. The last thing I want to talk about is terminated employees. Oftentimes there's a hard time, companies don't remove terminated employees fast enough. And there's a few reasons for it. Just the lack of communication between departments. Sometimes employees just don't show up anymore. So there's not a formal resignation letter. And so when they stop showing up, at what point are you contacting people and saying, hey, they don't work here anymore, remove their access? Another issue we're seeing now more of is, there's web-based applications. So you don't have to be on site to log into these applications. So removing their access very quickly is important. And you're seeing that also with the VPN access. More employees have VPN access than ever. So they can access your data from anywhere. And then moving on to the next slide. Some of the controls, you want to standardize as much as you can assignment and removal, have a policy in place, identify who's managing the individual applications. And once you do that, you can make sure that whenever an employee is terminated, those application managers are made aware of immediately so that they can immediately remove the access. You want to also make sure you have backups for those things, because what if someone's on vacation? You don't want it to be a week before that access is removed. Make sure that this includes assignment of keys or any kind of codes. This can be like a four-word passcode or something. Make sure those are changed when they leave. And then the next slide is just to implement periodic reviews. And we've kind of already discussed that, but just go through the list of users at least once a year. You might catch somebody who wasn't removed and should have been. The last topic I wanted to touch on is just a proper disposition of computer equipment. I think when I talk to businesses a lot, they are aware that you shouldn't just throw away a computer, but they might not be aware of the process. And a lot of times they're just collecting computers in a room, looks a lot like the picture to the right. And the question is, are you aware of what's in that room? And if somebody took something out of it, would you know? So make sure that you're aware of the inventory. Think about Internet of Things. These are smart TVs, thermostats, security cameras, refrigerators. They're on your network. They need to be disposed of the same way you would a computer. And the next slide, we're kind of just talking about what's the process. You're going to transfer all of your files. You're going to make sure you log out of all of your profiles, online banking, email. Another step to that is sign in on your new computer and make sure you forget that device that you're getting ready to get rid of. Make sure you unpair all of your Bluetooth devices, your mouse, your keyboard, your speakers, your Wi-Fi. Disconnect all of that. And then the next slide, we're just kind of talking about, you're going to erase your hard drive. You're going to remove the hard drive, try to destroy any ports, and then you're going to take it to a recycling center. There used to not be a recycling center in Charleston, but one just opened up in June 2021. If you're not in the Charleston area, you might want to check out NCER. They will typically list any kind of recycling happening in the area. They don't recycle it themselves, but they'll list events for you. Then we're going to talk about the good news. We've included some links that might be good for assessing tools for small businesses that you might want to check out. And then kind of our last slide, we're talking about how small businesses might be better prepared than larger businesses. So the SMB here stands for the small business. The 0% line is the average. So the very first one, the sound security strategy, small businesses are 2.3% more likely than average to have a sound security strategy. They're 13.4% more likely to have prompt disaster recovery, 6.5% more proactive in tech refresh, and 8.1% learn from prior incidents. And that pretty much concludes my portion of the presentation, unless you have anything else to say, Nancy. I think you're still on mute.
Oh. Yep, sorry. I think you got it great. One thing on that last slide was they talk about how small businesses have focus, resilience, and modernization, and those correspond with those answers to the survey questions, those that they're better off on those issues than the larger businesses. So great. I think we're ready for question or to turn it over to Glenn.
Yes, thank you, Nancy and Natalie, for quite an informative and insightful presentation today. It will help us all think about how to protect ourselves a little bit better and our IT systems and data. So I'll read some of the questions that were posted during the event and some that arrived by email before the event. So our first question is, how can I decide what backup types to use, file versus systems, then also incremental versus full?
Do you want me to take that? I can at least start with that since I did backups.
Sure.
I think the biggest thing to think about is those recovery point objective and recovery time objective. When you're talking about doing a file backup versus a system backup, you want to think about how easy it is for you to recreate that system. I mean, can you go to a website and re-download your software, or was that proprietary and you're going to have issues getting another version, say, of your operating system? Did you make a lot of configuration changes on that? If you answer yes to that, you might want to do the whole system backup. In terms of incremental versus a full backup, while the full backup takes longer and the incremental backup is shorter because you're just backing up the changes, the incremental backup can take you a lot longer to restore because you're going to have to go to a bunch of different backups to get all those changes. And so you want to think about that. Again, it may save you time as you're creating the backups, but may take you more time. If you do that full backup, when you get ready to restore it, you just have, one device you're restoring off of. So those are some things I can think of. Natalie, anything to add?
I absolutely agree. It's based on risk and how important is that information to you? How easily can it be recreated? And how long can you go without it? And then I think these are also things you want to continually review. So as your data gets bigger and bigger, you'll get a larger data set as you move on. It will take longer and longer to restore. So revisit that process at least annually and think about that again.
Thank you all. And, you mentioned employee training, you mentioned phishing, and it's something that we've all experienced, I think, in our workplace. Can you explain more about that and more about the employee training?
So I think a really good tactic for employee training, you can use a slide presentation and show, you want to show specific examples, but an even better control, you can have a third party, or you can do this internally. You can actually send phishing emails to your employees and see if they click on those emails. And then once that's done, what you want to do is make sure you follow up. So follow up with that employee who clicked on it, and then talk to them about how they could have identified this as a phishing email. So was it the email address that was a key giveaway? Was it the name? Was it the way things were spelled? Kind of point out those trigger points and make sure they understand how they could have noticed, and can keep testing them. And I think that's really the best way.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, the idea, that urgency idea, what I always do and tell people is ask someone else. If you're sitting in your office and you get something and it's from your boss or the owner of the company, talk about it with some of the other employees in your area, because chances are if it's phishing, they've all gotten it too. I know we've had some come across like that. And, you know, I would be thinking to myself, boy, I usually don't get an email like that from this person. And I've asked several other employees, and here they got the same thing. And we're all kind of laughing at that point. So yeah, while definitely sending internally made phishing emails for tests is great. Also just ask around, if, you know, before you act on something that seems urgent.
Good point. Can you explain more about a security risk assessment?
I could start on that. Basically, what you're going to do with any type of risk assessment, again, it's like an inventory. So what you want to do in a security risk assessment, whether that be information risk assessment or your IT risk assessment, you want to identify your assets. So what computer systems do you have? What software do you have? Do you have a server, et cetera? What are your assets? In terms of information, just like Natalie was talking about, for other controls, you want to identify the sensitivity of your data. So is it highly confidential, where you can't share it with anybody? Is it kind of semi-confidential, where, yeah, it's private, but it's not going to put you out of business if it gets stolen? Or is it public information, where, you know, it's information you have on your systems, but everybody can get access to it and it's not really going to harm your business? Once you've done that, you want to look at what your vulnerabilities are. So who has access to them? What part of your security software do you think, given this current security environment, do you think there's holes in it? You know, maybe you haven't taken a look at your vendor management risks and controls lately. Once you've done that, so you've identified your assets, you've figured out what your vulnerabilities are, then look at your controls. Well, you may want to rank it at that point to see which vulnerabilities are going to cause you most trouble in terms of the probability it could happen and the amount of money it's going to cost you if it happens. Then you can think about the controls you have and some additional controls you can put in, especially for those items that rank higher on your list. So to me, that is kind of what you do in one of those risk assessments. Natalie, do you have anything to add to that you've seen? Or
So after you do all of those steps, you get down to this is your residual risk. Then you need to decide, is that okay? Am I still at high risk even with my controls in place? And if you are, and if you're not okay with that amount of risk, what can you do for additional controls? It usually is, it's a kind of a risk versus how much money would it cost. If you have all the money in the world, you can be very secure, but you're going to address security issues based on risk.
Thank you. You mentioned having longer passwords. That's something that I tend to struggle with because I end up forgetting and then I have to go figure out, find the app. But can you explain more about that?
do you want to take that, Natalie, or should I?
Sure. As far as password cracking goes, the longer the password, the harder it is to crack. So making password length longer, you can actually go longer without changing your password. And so you want to try to think of things by maybe making it an entire sentence or several words strung together. That's better than coming up with a bunch of random characters. You'll be able to memorize it better and you can make it longer.
Yeah, and if I could add, the length is what is going to make it harder for a hacker to decrypt it if they steal it. So there's a really cool tool out there where you can, it's got a couple words like complexity and then a less than sign and then in length. And as you're typing that in, you can see how long it takes someone to crack it. And once it's 8 characters, and I think there's a symbol in there somewhere, it's still kind of a reasonable time that a hacker might try it. But once you add the less than sign and the word length, it gets to be like, 29 trillion days or years, something like that, something where a hacker's just going to give up. They're not even going to try. The other thing that I have heard is changing passwords. We usually think sometimes that having employees change passwords a lot is good, but I guess they found that sometimes they'll just add a character on the end, or they'll say, okay, well, I'm going to capitalize the first word this time I use it. And so the passwords can end up being too similar. So they're really advocating against that now, that changing of passwords, it didn't kind of work the way they had it intended. And another thing that you wouldn't think of is how you show the dots while you're typing your password. They did that obviously so someone looking over your shoulder couldn't see you, but that for a user, it gets frustrating because they can't see where they made their mistake, and it will lead them to making shorter passwords or easier passwords. So you could have it be an option where users could see it. And then, of course, if they're in a more public place, they could turn that feature off so that someone can't look over their shoulder. But that's something to think about as well with passwords.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Natalie. This wraps up today's Herd Insights Small Business Webinar. And we want to thank you for your participation and support for this event. And again, thank you, Natalie, for joining us today for the presentation with Nancy. The Herd Insights webinar series is a continuing series. Look for your registration email for the next event to arrive in a few weeks. We appreciate your participation today. You can always find us online on our social media pages at Herd Business. And always remember, we are Marshall.